Hello, and welcome back to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm so glad that you're here to join us today. A few weeks ago, we put a poll in the comment section asking you all which topic you would like to hear about next on the show. The most voted response was more conversations regarding euthanasia and assisted suicide, particularly in countries other than Canada. So on today's episode, Father Boquet joins us to discuss the situation in the UK regarding assisted suicide. As you may know, a bill was pushed through Parliament earlier this year and is now at the House of Lords. And Father also just returned from a mission to Ireland, so he brings a really unique perspective about how this topic is also a growing issue in Ireland. Obviously, a lot of the conversations regarding assisted suicide focused on the UK because that's where the bill was. So I was really interested in hearing Father's perspective about how this is a problem in Ireland as well. It's a great conversation full of all sorts of helpful information. One thing I absolutely loved about it was a perspective that Father brings towards the end of the conversation about how he would approach tough conversations regarding end-of-life issues in parish ministry. He shares what he was doing at the beginning and why that didn't work, and then what he did to pivot and have more fruitful conversations tackling tough topics with people in his parish. As always, if you're listening on our audio platforms, please pause right now and leave us a 5-star review. It's really helpful to help us reach new audiences. And if you're listening on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to the channel where we have new episodes every Thursday. And without further ado, please welcome Father Boquet to Living a Culture of Life. Welcome back to the podcast, Father.
Well, Colleen, as always, a great joy to be back with you again.
It's great to have you here, and I'm excited for our podcast today because we're going to be talking about the recent assisted suicide law or bill that was being pushed through the UK, and then also what's happening with this topic in Ireland. And I wanted to do this episode because a few weeks ago we put a poll in the comment section asking people to vote on which topics they wanted to hear about next, and one of the topics was euthanasia laws in other countries. Right. And so that was the top voted one. So I owe the audience this episode. But then also you just got back from Ireland, and that was when you mentioned that assisted suicide is a fight going on there right now.
Correct.
And since our last episode on Ireland also did well, I was like, let's just talk about this topic because clearly it's one that people are interested in. So yeah, let's start with the UK. So what happened this past June? There was a vote on a bill. Can you just tell our audience what's going on there?
Right. And I came with just some papers in front of me, so pardon me for looking down a little bit, but because we want to make sure we give the data points so that people can go back and review them themselves. So we're going back now to June. So this was in just recent where the UK, now this was, I've written on this a few times. So this was part of the way the process works going through the House of Commons is basically the MPs, are looking at various bills and have different readings. So it can go through kind of a few ways of how it's approached in the beginning. It might be changed, amendments might be made, a second reading may address it. Well, this is now the third reading. So this is where they come to this quote called final reading, and they really voted here, and I have the numbers, 314 votes to 291. So very close. Shows you how divided the House of Commons was on this very important issue. And also part of the vote was a freedom of conscience vote. Now, what that means is they could vote the way they wanted. So not by political party, not by, which one was the minority or the majority. Basically, it was also a vote that basically, what do they believe? And so there are the numbers. So again, just shows you how divided it is. And what this was, it's called the Terminally Ill Adults bill. So an end of life bill is what most people are calling it. And so what it does is it now we'll have to go to the House of Lords and receive a final vote. And we're assuming right now, because there's nothing I've seen of late, I went even today to look to see if any updates had occurred. I didn't see anything. We don't know what's going to happen. I mean, they could make more amendments. They could vote not in favor of it. But it's assumed and presumed that it will be passed, which is a very tragic thing. And what is it allowing? Well, as always, it's always an incremental approach. So what those who have advocated for this have said, it's going to be very limited. So for any of us in the pro-life and family movement knows, when you hear that language, all that means, here's the entry point. Once you can break the barriers and decriminalize an assault on human life, in this case, assisted suicide, euthanasia, then ultimately, immediately, once it's accepted, once it's signed into law, you're going to have a whole push. Well, now that it's open to certain groups of people, why can't we open it to other groups of people? And inevitably, it just becomes accepted across the board.
Alarm bells should be going off in your head of
it
limited
should.
situations.
It should. And so here, what I wrote down, I remember that this now new bill, right, that's now been passed by the MPs, by the House of Commons, is really amends the 1961 Suicide Act. So this goes to show you that, it's here we are. We're in 2025. Since 1961, in England and Wales, this is what was accepted, that assisted suicide, the taking of another human life was not permissible. So what this does, and it even carried a 14-year jail sentence if you abuse this law. Yeah. So what it does now, if it's accepted, so I wrote down, it's going to do is creates this process. And I know we're going to talk more about this. So this is dealing with a person that's within 6 months. So we're back down to an arbitrary period of time that, I mean by arbitrary here, 6 months is not arbitrary, it's 6 months. But what it does is a person, what does terminally ill mean? And so here, a person who is mentally capable of making a decision for themselves. So not a proxy, but in this situation, they are mentally stable, capable of making a decision, and then a panel of 2 judges, and possibly I couldn't find, there's different language that says 2 doctors and a judge.
Okay.
2 doctors and a panel and a judge. So I'm not sure exactly what that process looks like, all right, in the current way it's written. But basically 2 doctors with the high court, a judge agreeing to what the doctors have recommended, accepting the request. That's the process.
And our audience might remember from our episode on Canada's euthanasia laws a few weeks ago that Canada's are a lot looser. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Canada started off with something very similar to this, and then they've just been whittling or opening the doors on that, like the floodgates as the time's gone on.
It always, it very rarely that I've seen in anything, whether that would be with abortion, whether it be with the legalization of assisted suicide, or all the various complexities of issues affecting life today, always starts with an entry point, something that they say we will control. It will be very limited. It'll be restricted. We have policies that will protect it. We will uphold, the law. We will have, like even now, it still has a 14-year jail sentence attached to it.
They use emotional cases to kind of get the ball rolling, to get over that initial friction. And then once it's going, and it's interesting, once you see this pattern, you start seeing it in other areas. I forget. Might have been surrogacy was the topic I saw it on, where people were saying like, oh, this is going to be for infertile couples to be able to have a child. And then recently there was a story about this gay couple who had used surrogacy to have a child, and they found out later that one of the men was like a child predator, I believe was the story. And so it's like what it's sold to the public as, what the initial like, oh no, this is what we're going to use this for. Very quickly opens the floodgates to abuse.
Well, it's interesting because I'm going to read to you from the one who is the founder of the bill, the original bill. And please forgive me, Miss Kim, if I mispronounce your last name here, but I would call it Leadbeater, but it might be pronounced differently. But basically what she says, here, she's the one who has presented the bill. She's the author of the bill. And, and what she says in this quote, I'm going to read the quote. And, basically is, if we don't vote to change the law today, she says, what does this mean? So this is during that last vote. And so she's asking, it means we will have many more years of heartbreaking stories from terminally ill people and their families of pain and trauma, suicide attempts, PTSD, lonely trips to clinics in Switzerland, going outside the country, and then police investigation. So, and I'm saying this with really not trying to be sarcastic, but you can hear the kind of the strings being plucked here. It's heart-wrenching, it's emotional, you're touching where people's lives are, the difficulties of people faced with terminal illness, families dealing with those, the amount of money it might cost to care for loved ones. You can hear all the talking points.
And nobody wants those. Of
course.
But this isn't the solution.
That's right. And not only is it not the answer, but what does it bespeak of a country, of a people who, and that's what many on the opposite side, which is where we would be, is that this is not the answer.
It's never the answer.
None of us are looking to have prolonged suffering. No one is trying to say that someone has to have an unbearable journey in this path. But what is the response?
It's also interesting that she includes suicide attempts in that list, because That's what this is. It's assisted
Correct.
by a doctor, but it's still suicide.
Right. Well, it's interesting. The way they call the language is called assisted dying.
Mm.
So suicide is not mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
so because they don't want, again, you're trying to control the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're talking about is legalized murder. This is what we're talking about. And so we need to call it what it is. But these are what the proponents have been advocating for. And what you said, Colleen, is always the case
Mm-hmm.
for advocating whether for the legalization of abortion or for the legalization of assisted suicide, euthanasia. It always will use these very difficult cases,
Mm-hmm.
these moments filled with high emotion. And so, but what the opponents have always done is, and it's interesting, Bishop Barron the other day was talking about this, and I think it's a wonderful way of looking at it. And that is when someone posed the question about legalizing assisted suicide,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he says, well, the presumption is that we have complete autonomy. Well, we don't have autonomy in the way that they would define it.
Mm-hmm.
We are sons and daughters of Almighty God. He is the author of life. I am not.
Mm-hmm.
And I am not the self-determining factor in my life.
Mm-hmm.
God is. And to realize that there is a higher being and there is a higher responsibility, and my life has a value.
Mm-hmm.
Always. It never loses that value, even when I face great suffering and the possibility of my own impending death.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change. So the idea that there's this assumption that I can do whatever I want to do because it's my body. This is the language they've used in the culture of death for decades. It's false. It's based on a false position.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important for us not to lose the ground on the argument,
Mm-hmm.
and to realize that, this understanding of autonomy is false. Yes, as the ethical and religious directives of Catholic healthcare speak of our own principles,
Mm-hmm.
that when it comes to making decisions, moral decisions about the path before me, yes, as the patient, I have the obligation and the duty and the right. But there are limits to that as well. I cannot do anything to hasten my death. I can't do anything to cause my death.
Mm-hmm.
So there are limits to my so-called autonomy, my decision making. But it's important to see the value. And that's lost on the proponents of assisted suicide. That's not where they start. They start with basically, I can do whatever I wish to do.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting that even Ms. Kim, who's authored the bill here, is kind of given limits, because they start off with those so-called limits.
Mm-hmm.
Only within 6 months, must be a terminal illness, must be of cognitive ability,
Mm-hmm.
and it has to be approved by 2 doctors, approved by this. So in a way, they are limiting autonomy.
Yeah.
They are limiting it.
Well, and that's exactly the argument they're going to use in the future to open the doors of, it's discrimination if you discriminate against this
That's
group.
correct.
And that's what we were seeing in Canada. Also, to that point, when we had the Canada episode, we talked about doctor shopping as well. And so if you need 2 doctors to sign off on approval to be murdered or to kill yourself, and a doctor says no, then people will just go and find another doctor who will do it for them.
And eventually, what happens when you remove, in this situation, as it is written,
Mm-hmm.
that it is actually the individual that's making the request?
Mm-hmm.
What happens when we take the individual out and it's a family member that makes the request?
Mm-hmm.
What happens? So what you just said, the moment that you open the door, then you will see, as you just beautifully explained,
Mm-hmm.
then it's going to be where you're discriminating against me, or now what about my brother, my mother, my dad, who's lost cognitive ability. But before they were ever in that case, they never wanted to suffer like this. They never wanted to have a prolonged illness like this.
Mm-hmm.
You're depriving me of fulfilling my loved one's wishes.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see how all this is now going to lead to more legal cases, and eventually, basically, it'll just be without restriction. And so what we'll see here is what we see in Canada with MAID, medically assistance in dying, MAID. And so it's a real problem, and it's very, very sad to see. And what I love about many of the articles that have been addressing the issue
Mm-hmm.
is how they've taken the conversation, Colleen, a little higher. So they moved it out of the legal realm and looking at it alone, and looking at what are the implications to the culture, to the larger picture of society.
Mm-hmm.
How does it bespeak of us when what we offer to people who are in legitimate need and of need of legitimate care,
Mm-hmm.
not only care with medicine,
Mm-hmm.
but tenderness, solidarity, concern, what does that say of us as a culture and as a
Yeah.
people?
None of these decisions happen in a vacuum. They
Right.
all are going to have long-term or short-term effects on everything that's around it, like a ripple
Right.
effect in the water. I remember when we had Dr. Jennifer Morris on the podcast,
Mm,
she was talking about how she used to be an economist. And she said that kind of framework for like, okay, if you do this, like what's the domino effect,
that's
is
correct.
really helpful at looking at life issues. If you change this one thing, okay, that might seem fine in the surface, but
Right.
then what effect is that having in the broader
That's right.
culture?
And also from even like you just said, so how does it affect the medical community?
Hmm.
How do they now approach the topic?
Yeah.
Once you start letting the mores that really govern and sustain a response,
Hmm.
and you start pulling those apart and you start shearing those boundaries and you start breaking them down,
Hmm.
then you might have external pressure coming upon an individual,
Yeah.
upon a family member to make made feel that you must make this decision. They may not even be considering this path,
Hmm.
but may find themselves pressured toward this path.
What do you think are some areas that could be affected? Like off the top of my head, I'm thinking palliative care. So once this is kind of the option, people who are in the palliative care industry may not be as inclined to provide like the best palliative care. They might urge people to
Hmm.
get go forward with assisted dying or assisted suicide.
Right.
What are some other areas that could be affected where
Well,
this will?
what you're mentioning, I think, is the primary starting point because
Okay.
how does the medical, community address, as I just
Hmm.
said, and we're talking about, how does it affect not only the long-term care? So
Hmm.
how do we deal with palliative care, but also in the sense of how does it affect the issue of medicines?
Hmm.
How does it affect the issue of providing, long-term care facilities?
Hmm.
How does it affect skilled facilities, caring for the sick and the dying?
Hmm.
How does it affect, from a financial point? How do we as a country, how do we use our funding, our resources that are governed from our taxes and, other
Hmm.
means? How do we, as good stewards, how do we distribute that
Yeah.
amount of money? What becomes the limit?
Hmm.
These are all things that are affected on every level. And from policy making, to the way the government decides how much money it will allocate toward, socialized medicine in this case.
Hmm.
How will it advocate for spending so much money for pharmaceuticals, research?
Hmm.
These are all kind of things that come into play.
We've talked about that before with, I think it was both IVF and the birth control pill, where it's like how much like studies into women's fertility has suffered because women are just
Right.
given the pill. Like, oh, you have heavy bleeding or like painful periods
Right.
here, just take the pill instead of like actually doing research into what's actually causing that, the underlying
Right.
cause. And then you have the same
Exactly.
risk with IVF, where it's like, oh, we'll just use IVF if you can't get pregnant
Right.
instead of let's actually do further research. Like you end up having this whole body of like scientific studies that could happen but aren't necessarily
Right.
happening
Right.
because no one wants to fund that when there's an easy
That's right.
band-aid
And
solution. And
also, I would say with that, you're absolutely correct. I mean, instead of investing where we need to invest,
mhm,
we kind of remove ourselves from that conversation where we
mhm,
could be finding other means of approach that would really respect human persons, respect
yeah,
their dignity, and be able to maybe resolve some of these medical dilemmas that are before us. But also with that, you think about with John Paul, back to Evangelium Vitae,
mhm,
and speaking about suicide and euthanasia and assisted suicide,
mhm,
that you're removing us from our responsibility toward our neighbor.
yeah,
So we're back now to this principle of solidarity and my responsibility toward my neighbor. I can answer the question, you are my neighbor, period.
mhm,
There's never an out in that. And so what is my obligation? And here we're not just speaking from a religious point. We're
mhm,
talking about what's the role of medicine? What's
yeah,
the role of government? What's the role of society,
yeah,
in approach to our neighbor?
mhm,
Because it also has to answer the same question. I mean, government has to, who's my neighbor?
yeah,
Well, government exists for the well-being of each individual in the community.
mhm,
How is government serving that need?
mhm,
And if government is giving permission and arbitrarily determine a certain segment of society
mhm,
can decide that their life is no longer of value, right? Right now it's putting the authority in the person, but
mhm,
that could change. Look at Paul VI in Humanae Vitae talked
yeah,
about the issue of accepting contraception
mhm,
as an approach, and he prophesied very clearly, and all of them have come to bear. And how could government use this to their leverage?
mhm,
And why? Because let's get underneath all of it,
mhm,
all right? And that is, let's look at the breakdown of the family.
yeah,
So what's led us to the point where, at once in a given society, believed in the role of family toward their family members, caring for them when they were sick, being present for them when they were dying, the role of the individual in the family. But because of the breakdown of the family, the divorce rate, the separation issue, the very fact that families having low birth rates, I mean, this all plays into this.
Yeah, we had a great conversation a few weeks ago on that, of just like the role of like being able to protect the elderly from the throwaway culture, but then also how the elderly have a lot to contribute to their family and to their communities as well.
That's correct. That's correct. So and that's why what I love about the church is that she does look at things from all these perspectives, but she never loses the sight of the human person who, whose rights and dignity must always be protected, even from themselves at times, as in this situation. And that's what John Paul II was talking about, in the sense of, and even recently of Pope Francis, talked about this, of how some people are made to feel that because of their age or their illness, that they're no longer worthy of life, no longer have a value. So the throwaway culture you just mentioned that Pope Francis would often use, in his articulation about this. And it's so true. When a person feels they're unworthy of life, or because they don't understand that, yes, the suffering that you may be dealing with, the difficulty you're dealing with, we're going to be able to walk with you. We will manage your pain. We will stay with you. We will be at your side. But there's also the value that one needs to see, what we speak of in that redemptive suffering. And that language is lost to society in so many ways. This is where, again, the church brings, this greater message, this larger message about life and the beauty of life and the wonder of life and the limitation of life. And accepting the fact that I am not in this present mode I'm a finite being. I'm not an infinite being, but yet I have a promise of eternal life.
I remember. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying that's the part, Colleen, that I think it also gets lost as we're talking about these issues.
When you're talking about redemptive suffering, it just made me think of, I think it's Father Mike Schmitz's Catechism in a Year. He starts off talking about the problem of like suffering, problem of evil. Right. And he says like basically the entire catechism is the church's response to that problem.
That's correct.
And it's like,
that's correct.
It is like we do live in a fallen world, and there is always going to be suffering. And like the church is the remedy.
I remember reading a little quote of recent, and I won't get it perfect, because right now it's Mother Angelica talked about, and even Mother Teresa, both of them, how we look at the little inconveniences, the struggles, even the daily sufferings as opportunity to become more perfect, to be perfected. And so again, it's a very different approach. But again, I want to pull back a little deeper. Pope Benedict XVI, in speaking about Europe, and we remember that as Europe has become more de-Christianized, right, and has lost sight of its root within Christianity, right, it loses sight of these perspectives. It approaches things from a very secular point of view, right, Colleen? And when we start doing that, then we begin to view life from a secular, from what my eye perceives or my emotion may feel, and not considering the broader picture, the fuller perspective of the dignity of each and every person, even as they face human suffering. And so how do we have this richer, deeper conversation? And that's what I made reference to by reading many articles, to hear people raising the conversation, moving it further and deeper.
What has some of the pushback against this bill looked like?
Well, people, all the things we really are talking about, because what many of the opponents are addressing, at least at first value, on first level, is how will it be used for exploitation? So they're not in favor of any approval of this at all, but they're looking at it and saying, the moment you allow this, what will be the consequence? And so they're looking at it. So how do you avoid the fact of those that may have a very different approach, may have a different intention? The person may be approaching because they are dealing with this reality, whether we agree or disagree with it. But what happens with others? How do doctors approach it? Like we said, with issues in Canada, how people are just kind of shopping around for doctors that will buy into their position. What I didn't see here was an age. So right now, and again, I didn't read all of it to say, is there an age limit? Are we talking about a child of 6? Are we talking about a child of 5? Is there an age limit to where a person, because a child in some countries can make this decision on their own? Where is this going to fall? What about the very fact of mental issue. See, mental cognitive ability can be judged very differently. So that's one of the questions that's been raised is that, a person who is suffering, who is struggling, maybe they may have the mental capacity, to make decisions, but maybe their decision in this regard is so heavily influenced by their own difficulty and their own situation that they can't see beyond it. All they see is this.
Yeah.
So there are so many ways of approach on this that people are raising. How does government play? And I mentioned earlier, what happens when you have limited medical resources? What happens when government can no longer sustain a long-term care? And so basically what they're saying, hey, I can't give you A, but I can offer you to assist you if you wish to have assisted suicide, assistance in dying. Remember, they're not going to use our terminology. So it comes across as this compassion, but compassion, really truly means to have empathy, to have concern for. And, and as John Paul would say, you don't kill the person, that's having the struggle, so that's not the answer. Yeah. The answer is true compassion. And recognizing my obligation toward this person. Also, what will happen, as you mentioned earlier, so instead of looking for ways for true palliative care, why put research into that, or why put resources into that when I can offer this so-called alternative? It's cheaper, it's easier, and we're done much more quickly. And so it changes mindset. It affects behavior. That behavior then affects policy. I mean, I'm using this now on a policy government perspective, and then it can change how the hospital approaches its ministry. It affects how a clinic may approach its ministry. So you can see how all these things begin to tentacle.
I feel like we've kind of already gone in this direction, but I feel like it turns the medical system into like a business rather than a ministry. Right. Instead of caring for the human person, it's like, what's the quickest, easiest way to deal with this at the least expense to us, or the least problem?
Do no harm. And so we've lost sight of that primary principle, do no harm. And how can we recognize? So none of us are, not even, the opponents, no one's argued that there is real human suffering, that there are situations that are very painful to observe, painful to hear about, and for those in the midst of it to endure. No one is arguing that, but is the answer the death of that person, the hastening of the death of that person? Instead of recognizing the fact that we are finite creatures, that we all are going to face this moment at a stage of our lives. And what is our obligation toward that individual?
It's also a challenge towards us as Christians, is like, if you know people in those suffering situations, what can you do either to help relieve the suffering of the person who's suffering, or to help the caregivers who might feel overwhelmed, stressed out? They don't want to care anymore because they feel completely maxed out. Of like, what can you do to relieve their burdens that they can better serve the individual?
And if I can return back to Pope Francis, I mean, think about, so all of a sudden we're actually looking at a segment of the population. We are arbitrarily looking at a particular segment and saying, with that individual, we agree that you no longer have value. Not saying that, but that's what we're saying.
Yeah.
And so literally, we are truly segmenting a segment of society. And here, it's normally going to be the elderly.
Yeah.
It's going to be predominantly the elderly.
Yeah.
Who are the most vulnerable. We're talking about vulnerable people here. And so whether or not they have cognitive ability to make a decision, they're still vulnerable. And they're vulnerable because they're dealing with a terminal illness. They're dealing with something that's very, very real.
Anyone who's suffering is vulnerable in some way.
Exactly. And that's why even Pope Francis, now Pope Leo, of course, picking this message up as well. And so what is our response?
Yeah.
Not to throw away or to condone their desire to throw their life away. But even as Pope Francis said about, he wasn't even talking about the terminally ill. In many of the documents, he was just talking about our approach, you brought it up, toward the elderly, toward those who have reached a certain age, right? Whatever that age may be. But they reached a certain age. How do we as a society look at them? How do we treat them? Again, I mentioned certain countries and reading articles that look at the elderly of their country and saying, you just need to go away. You're wasting resources. It's time for us to come forward. It's our time now. So we really are looking at a segment of society, and we're saying that to them, which is very utilitarian,
Mm-hmm.
right? Very arbitrary, and you no longer have a value, a contribution. And in a way, the person who approaches this is where they may find themselves. And don't get me wrong, there are people that have a mindset that they just want to have their exercise their autonomy. We talked about earlier, and that's plain and simple. That's how they're approaching it. And so we have to be able to answer that as well, as we talked about earlier. So the role here from the opponent side is, which is going to be based in ethic, in morality, in religious principles. We have to not lose our own narrative and not be afraid to articulate that narrative. Because what we're going to find, Colleen, is what I think is going on in Ireland now. So, which is, and that is, having come from there, this is my second mission this year to the beautiful country of Ireland, and already talking about a return, because what I see in Ireland is, because we're dealing with part of the UK, we're dealing with a mindset that's affecting England and Wales and the rest of the UK and its influence, is how do people approach this topic?
And then it's going to affect Northern Ireland as well, which I'm sure bleeds into.
Of course. And so we're just going to think for a moment. Let's go back to birth rates just for a moment.
Okay.
So England and Wales, 1.3. So in an article I wrote this just recently that was just released, I talked about, the very fact that there are now demographers, because I ought to give a pop test. I'm not going to give it to you. I like to give it to our audience, but I won't do that. So what is the replacement rate? So we know it to be 2.125. So basically what we're talking about is 3 children that would be born to a family. So, and I don't like the word replacement, but I'm going to use the language, and that is, mom and dad, quote, have been replaced.
Yes.
And with 1 above that number, 3.
And that would take into account anybody who dies without ever having children, for people who become priests and religious who aren't going to have more children. So you end up keeping your population generally stable. But
a recent article that I actually link in my recent column talks about that number's too low, and that we ought to maybe look at, that it should be 2.7, maybe 2.8, which means now we're moving toward 4. We're moving in a larger number. Why? Because of all the things you just mentioned, and because of mortality, because of fertility issues, because now we have a population that have chosen not to have children at all.
Do dog children count?
So no, and so a little tongue in cheek there. But what you're doing there, so you look at England and Wales, and you see 1.3, already far, far below replacement. We have Ireland. 1.4 depends on 1.5. So it depends on which study you're looking at. Still well below replacement. So back to the late Holy Father, talking about, an aging population. So what is the response when the very fact that your our demographic pyramid that you talked about last time we were together on this issue, and that obviously the lower platform of our triangle, which is on my bottom of my thumbs here, would be where the younger population would reside.
What it should be is the bottom is big and the top is small.
And the top is very small. What's happened is we have now what we say an inverted pyramid. So where we have a younger population on the bottom and an older population on the top. So that has both political, sociological, economical impact that we're now seeing in what we call the demographic winter.
Well, and as a side note to our listeners too, a lot of times people will say, oh, well, if you have a low birth rate, immigration is going to be what's the solution to that. And obviously that's a loaded topic in a lot of ways, but that solution, even if it is a solution, doesn't work when globally you have an under replacement rate.
And it's just not sustainable.
Yeah.
It's just not sustainable.
So that argument of oh, well, we'll just solve it with immigration is completely flawed when this is a global issue.
And in the United States, as I reported in that recent column, now has gone down a percentage point, basically from 1.7 to 1.6. And also just shows that what masks the United States, at least right now, is the immigration number, right? And so, but that again is not sustainable. And so it's going to eventually show itself even there. So, but right now what you're seeing is, what are the impacts toward medicine, healthcare? Not beyond healthcare, what about just the simple care of people in general? Housing, right? What about, how does it affect in the United States, our language, Medicare, Medicaid? How does it help a state that has its own healthcare, systems. How does all this get maintained when the resources that you need in order to drive those resources for people are no longer present?
And I think you mentioned, I think it was in your most recent article too, of when you have generations with a low birth rate, even if like people of childbearing age right now had like whatever, three,
Right,
four
right,
replacement children, that's still like, that's a lot of work that would need to happen
right.
because you've had so many
That's correctly.
generations of this being an
That's right.
issue.
That was in reference to South Korea,
Okay.
which is 0.72.
Wow.
It is well below 1,
Yeah.
which means that not the average woman is not even having a child. So
Interesting.
this is a real, and demographers actually, I don't want to get into that side. That's
Yeah,
a whole
that's a
other
whole
moment.
other
But what it does
podcast.
though is it just shows how did we get to this point? So in Ireland, what's my concern is how the government is approaching this topic and being influenced by what they see in Great Britain, what they see coming out of other countries like Sweden, Canada, United States. So it's very impactful to how people think, because they think it's a solution, and what they're seeing so-called are positive outcomes, but they're not looking at the entire package of what are the long-term impacts psychologically, sociologically. How does it affect? So they're all looking at it from an economic point of view. And again, because we valorize autonomy, right? We've elevated it to the golden calf, and it's an illusion. It's a complete illusion. And if left to its own, it's a cancer.
What is the situation in Ireland? Because I think a lot of people, if they've been kind of paying sort of attention in the news, probably heard about the UK bill, because I heard a lot of people talking about that. I saw a lot of posts online. The Ireland one surprised me when you got back from Ireland and you said that assisted suicide is an issue over there as well right now. So could you just tell our audience like the facts of whatever that situation
and
is?
again, I came with paper in hand.
Oh, good.
So understanding that, under the Criminal Law Suicide Act, this is currently the law that is in place that was passed in 1993, the year I was ordained a priest. And so 32 years ago. And so this is still the governing law of Ireland. But in 2024, and of course a little bit before then, but in 2024, one of its committees on justice and inequality, attempted to encourage government to legalize or begin to open the conversation toward what they call assistance in dying. So assisted suicide. And basically, this report began in 2021. This is when this conversation started getting a lot of traction. So what happened was there was an attempt in 2024 to move some legislation forward. It died. All right. But it doesn't mean that the momentum is not there for it to be picked up. It is still there. And what I'm noticing is what I'm hearing, and this is what the concern is from people in general, so lay people, families, but I'm hearing it from religious as well and priests, that in Ireland, you can go into hear people say, well, I'm gonna make up a couple of names. Betty's going to die tomorrow at 3 p.m. Frank's going to die, tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And when they're hearing this and going, wait a minute, what do you mean they're going to die? And in reality, what they find is that we're having people, now this is dealing with pain management, medication being used for pain management. And these, again, we've all had these conversations about there is a moral means, all right, of approaching, pain management for those that are suffering and those that are dying, end of life issues. But this is what we're talking about here is how certain dosages are being given, and what's happening is basically it's we're dealing with euthanasia.
So they're not using these drugs for the sake of pain management to make the patient more comfortable. They're using them to hasten the death.
That would be, the assumption that
allegedly,
right? But the language they're using. So first of all, it's not legal. So it's under the guise of pain, using of pain management, guiding, helping people in these end of life moments. But what happens is that no discussion with family. And again, if there is any discussion, it's the same thing we've been talking about with the UK, with England and Wales, and the idea of, we don't want your mom to suffer, we can help with that. We can, and just of recent, while I was there, a family member reached out to me while in one of the missions, one of the conferences, and said they had a family member where the hospital administration and the medical staff was encouraging, for them to, that we can help alleviate your mom's suffering. Just this language, the way they're speaking. And they finally said, well, what do you mean? And it kind of just got dropped. And so it made them very suspicious.
Yeah.
And so as a result, so you're wondering, again, and what you're hearing from the priest as well, they're raising the questions because they're being called to situations, that have been said, again, Betty's going to die at 4, Frank's going to die at 10. And they're going, how do you know so specifically? And it's one thing, obviously, for those in healthcare that have built up wisdom and knowledge of people as we all go through the stages
so many
of dying.
Days to live, or
right?
Like,
looking
this is
at the
what you can
natural things that are
expect.
occurring. Yes, that's one thing, and that could be part of that, but not in a specific time frame. And in reality, the priest said they find out it's exactly what occurred. And so it's raising so many questions, and what it's doing is it's kind of creating a swell where it becomes almost kind of accepted, and this is what's happening. This is kind of turn a little blind eye to what's going on because it's under the guise of compassion and care, and then what happens is then you can see how the argument is going to go on. Well, it's already happening. This is people are looking for a way to not suffer and have a prolonged illness, and we're depriving people of their autonomy and their ability to make decisions,
right, to be able to have this, etc.
Right, and so so what I found in this particular mission, as I heard earlier in the year, were these questions and people asking, what is the church's response? What is my response, when a loved one is asking, and how do I respond to that? What is the church's position on pain management, medications that might have a double effect, right? Has a good effect and a bad effect. We're back to the principle of double effect here. How do we approach this, right? So what about palliative care, right? Are we talking about this? And what I also found, Colleen, which was very concerning to me, and as I say what I'm getting ready to say, I'm painting with a very big brush, and I know that it's in the sense of, but what people are saying is they're not receiving guidance from our spiritual shepherds. They're not hearing from the church herself through her shepherds how to address, or that there is even an issue. An example of this would be in Ireland, and again, I haven't done enough research on the policy yet, but I know that this is the practice now. So in Ireland, now on the issue of organ donation, which is a separate topic altogether in itself, one that we can spend ample time on. But what's happening here in Ireland is you have to opt out. It's assumed that you've already opted in. So that's raising tremendous questions.
And here in the U.S., you have to opt in. You have to say, I want this, check on my driver's license or whatever.
And there's many other ways of ensuring, that's not arbitrarily done and haphazardly done, or someone's done it for you. But they're literally, and people don't know how to do the process.
Well, and as Bobby Kennedy said a few weeks ago, if they've realized that a lot of organs are being taken from people who are already alive.
So there's a lot of questions
going on here,
and we need to talk about this in greater detail. Meaning,
it's not a settled issue.
The community, we need exactly. But what's happening there, and again, and I don't live there. I'm not there every day. I'm hearing this as I move along. Yeah. And each one of my missions is typically between 10 to 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks. So I'm there enough and moving around the whole country. And when you hear this coming from each segment, north, south, east, west, it means
it's a broad issue, not just an issue at one hospital or one community.
Which means we're looking toward our shepherds, our authority, especially on the moral issues and on the principles, to guide us, to also defend us, to protect us, and to ask questions where maybe myself as a citizen that doesn't have the authority or the influence the bishops can. And I don't want to put this all on the bishops, but in a sense, they are our spiritual shepherds, and we need them, to be engaging in this conversation and to be asking legitimate questions of authority. This is what we are hearing from the people of God. And so what is this? And, we need to investigate. Is this legitimate? Are these real things really happening? When we have priests coming to us and saying, this is what we're hearing at the skilled center or the healthcare center or the hospital. This is what we're hearing. So how do we engage? And then if I just take that aside, this was my approach with Patrick McChrystal and HLI Ireland, is spending time with our team and with our volunteers, walking through the ethical and religious directives of Catholic healthcare in the sense of what are the principles? So as a church, how are we teaching as a church specifically now with our Catholic doctors, our Catholic nurses? Obviously, it affects everyone, but how do we start so that they become more knowledgeable and begin to understand what we teach, why we teach it, what's it about, how we have an identity? So
I think there's a lot of issues that Catholics don't realize they don't know until they're encountering that situation. You don't really think about, okay, what is the church's teaching on pain management drugs at the end of life until you encounter something where you have a loved one who has to face that. And then all of a sudden you're scrambling, being who do I know who knows this, who I can reach out to, and who I can trust. I remember Dr. Joseph Meany was talking when we had him on the podcast 3 years ago about the National Catholic Bioethics Center's hotline where people can call and just be like, hey, I have this urgent question. What is the ethical thing to do here? It's important to make sure that people know where to turn when they do have questions, and then also educate people so they don't have to scramble.
Exactly. So it's not just those in the vocation of medicine. Myself, do I understand what the church teaches me and my response? So in a sense, we're back to people in in Great Britain and England, Wales, and Ireland, many other countries. There are things that I might have a choice, but those choices are not moral. So I need to know also. So it's not me looking at others. It's also, what is my obligation to know what is right from wrong? What is good and what's not good? And be able to make moral decisions that really reflect my own human dignity. And that whether or not I have autonomy or the government says I have, the reality is I can't choose an evil in order to accomplish some good. I want to alleviate my suffering, but I can't choose that which is immoral in order to achieve that end. So these are things that are so important that most of our people, this is what that toss it back to you, but keep your thought, is what I in meeting with people, this is something that they were surprised by, because we are not guiding, all right? We're not giving, the care that people need to understand, so that when they are in a medical dilemma, they are in a moral decision-making moment, how to make that decision.
Well, and then also, how do you charitably and prudentially do it when it could be an extended family member, where maybe it's not so direct that you're like, okay, this is my parent and I actually have a degree of authority for doing this. But if it's my cousin's husband or my cousin's parent or something like that, where you're just removed enough of how do you approach this in a way that's charitable and helps them see what's true? But and doesn't just turn them off. Because if you go in there guns blazing being don't you dare do this, they might just close you out, never want to hear it again, and you didn't help the person, and you've just severed a bond. But then at the same time, you don't want to just sit there and keep your mouth shut. So not only do you need guidance on the principles, but then guidance on how to prudentially present those in a way that someone can actually receive and will do the most good.
So if I could just speak to that. So when I was back in parish ministry, this was the attempts that I tried. So as I was visiting the homebound, so those that were no longer able as mobile. So, and I recognized when I would get called to the hospital, called to a nursing facility, a lot of times decisions were already made, Colleen. And so it was very hard in those given moments, though I tried my earnest, to offer correction, to offer, an objective teaching to their dilemma. A lot of times I walked out going, it wasn't heard, but it was because a decision had already been made, emotionally charged, people just not listening in that given moment because of all that circumstance. And so I decided, how can I proactively try to limit those moments? And so what I decided was that in the homebound ministry, long before there was a terminal illness.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been just simply age-related issues happening,
Mm-hmm.
and things were unfolding. Yes, we began to talk about it. I would bring it up with them and
Mm-hmm.
just say, you have any questions for me? And it would open the door for them to ask, and eventually, it could be family members that were their caregivers. It could have been the proxy that's going to be responsible asking legitimate questions. What about food and water? What about, medication? What about if we know a medication actually might have a bad effect as we're trying to do something good?
Mm-hmm.
And so people began to start asking. And as a result, I began to have less and less at the end of life,
Mm-hmm.
these decisions. And more than that, I would have people actually, call me from hospitals and say, nurses or doctors, and say, Father, can you come over? The family has raised something that, we're not very familiar with.
Yeah.
And then eventually it began to be doctors and nurses that began to ask questions,
Mm.
and coming from a Catholic background, but never having the formation.
Yeah.
And so they're thinking, well, why am I only hearing this for the first time? Where can I read more? Where do you get that from? Can you prove your point? What it is, but it
Yeah.
opened doors.
Well, and it helps provide, like, first of all, I love that. That's like a really beautiful story of just like how, like, a way that kind of being forward looking, you can approach this of like, okay, how can I lay this foundation here? But to go off of that point, sometimes it's harder to make the like more logical conversation, have like a more logic based conversation when something is so emotionally charged. But if you can kind of lay that foundation ahead of time, you're helping people understand the principles, you're kind of helping them build a framework that they can evaluate things through so that then when they're hit with an emotionally charged
That's
situation,
correct.
they actually kind of know where to guide that towards,
Right.
and they're not just, like, making things based off of, like, "Oh, shoot, I don't know how to deal with this. I'm just gonna go with this because this is what the doctor says."
Right. And again, also it's the knowing that they can call, quote, the church.
Yeah.
Father, what do I do? Sister, what can
Mhm.
I do? Begin to start bringing people into the conversation, which is
Mhm.
solidarity.
Yeah.
We're walking with you. You're not alone.
And it's also that idea of you can't really do fraternal correction without the fraternal. Like, you have
That's
to build
correct.
that relationship
That's
to be able
correct.
to do the correction, so
That's right.
in this case, you're kind of letting them know that you have the answers. Maybe not,
That's
like,
correct.
or you know where to turn to get the answers, and
That's
you're
right.
building that relationship, so then when they do have like, either when you have to enter like, when you have to give someone a little bit of correction or when they
Right.
have a question,
That's right.
you have already built that relationship and
That's
have
right.
that foundation.
Because sometimes you do have to give a fraternal correction. I mean,
Mhm.
because that this is not right,
Mhm.
and so and you have to stand your ground.
Mhm.
At the end, yes, I mean, I'm not the decision maker,
Mhm.
and at the end, I may have no authority at all. And sometimes and it have happened, I was dismissed from the room
Mhm.
because I disagreed,
Yeah.
and I shared that just very respectfully but firmly,
Mhm.
and in the realization that I know that I walked out with a heavy heart,
Mhm.
knowing that a decision that they were making was not the moral decision that needed to be made,
Mhm.
and asking myself, did I do enough? Did I
Mhm.
do all my part? And reevaluating and assessing
Yeah.
because a life is at stake,
Yeah.
even if that life is, as we're talking about from the beginning, moving toward the latter part of a natural process. But
Yeah.
we still don't hasten their death. We
No.
don't deprive them by omission
Mhm.
or by commission,
Mhm.
right? Causing or removing something from them that disrespects their dignity.
Yeah.
And so what we're talking about, today in reference to, to England and Wales, and we're talking about what I'm seeing in places like Ireland,
Mhm.
and what's happening in our own country here in the United States, where many of the states, are now trying to, to implement and legalize,
Mhm.
assisted suicide, assistance
Yeah.
in dying, trying to follow the path of Canada. But what people need to do is just open their eyes, not because of the abuses of medically assistance in dying made, but to look at the very fact we're dealing with a human person.
Mhm.
And what we're dealing with is my responsibility toward my neighbor. And to recognize that all of us will face these moments of human life,
Mhm.
and the very fact that each of us, whether it be age related, whether it be disease related, we all are going to reach a moment where we're going to need the love and care and tenderness and the compassion and assistance of others.
Mhm.
And it bespeaks better of a society and a culture that stands with their brother and their sister
Mhm.
and loves them when science can no longer provide in its beauty and its awe and what a wonder medicine is. But when it can no longer provide, then what we can provide is tenderness, love, care, presence, and to know that this is not the end of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the part that gets lost in all of this. And you and I have had podcast after podcast, and God knows how many articles I've written. What brings so many of our sisters to an abortion mindedness is the feeling of abandonment, being alone, being pressured, feeling that this is the only answer to their situation. And yet when they walk into a pregnancy care center and someone offers them the very thing I just articulated when standing with someone terminally ill at the end of life, I'm here, we will help you. We're, it changes the mindset. And so here, this is not the answer. What they're doing here, and that's what the bishops of England have been very outspoken, very critical of this. And I would say what we need is both that fraternal correction, but a firm resolve. To the Catholics who are in the House of Commons who voted for this, they need to be held accountable. Many of them, maybe not educated, but I can tell you the bishops in England and Wales have been very outspoken, Colleen, since the first inception of this bill.
Good.
So it's been a lot of things have been discussed, but there are people that don't know. They really don't. Yeah. But we need to engage. And part of engagement is education, but accountability. And we're afraid to talk about sin, and we're afraid to talk about the consequence of sin. And I would say this from a spiritual side, that the evil that's being advocated here is not in a vacuum. No. It will perpetuate itself. It will grow into others. And let's go back here. When was abortion legalized? Right? And I'm not going to answer that because I want our audience maybe to do a little reading. When was abortion legalized in England and Wales? So what we see is a continuation of this great evil.
Yeah.
And so it's because when you disregard life at any stage, in this case, at the beginning of life, a vulnerable life, an innocent life, and now we can take that now toward the end. And what brought us to that decision, right? And I'm going to give you a clue: 1960s. All right, so it's when all this came into there. Right?
Yeah, you've got me distracted. I'm trying to figure out what year it was.
But I want our audience maybe to do a little research. But the idea is to think here, because it's right in front of me. I can tell you the date. It's right in front of me. So, but the idea is people thinking nothing happens in a vacuum.
No.
And so the moment we open, and what the cardinal in England said so beautifully, what Mother Teresa used to call is the slippery slope that we're often accused. There's no such thing. Of course there is. Yeah. And the moment that you say that person no longer has value, then I can turn around and say, well, that person no longer has value.
Exactly.
And then I can start moving all over the spectrum.
And then what does it mean to have value? Because if one person doesn't have value, then nobody has value. And how do you determine that?
The value?
Yeah.
And so this is why it's important for us to stop all this and return to what truly is our response to our brother and sister. And that is legitimate care and love and accompaniment and solidarity and assisting someone in their greatest moment of need and vulnerability and assuring them that the Lord is with them. The Lord, our Lord Jesus Christ, died that we might have life, that not even death and not even this illness or this old age can separate me from that love and from that desire of that love that longs for me to share in his abundant life. This is what we have to preach. Yeah. And also, as I quoted Mother Angelica and Saint Mother Teresa, the idea that these little moments are moments also to refine me, to help me, to teach me.
And I was going to say, I feel like if you cooperate with those little moments throughout your life, you're going to be much more prepared to accept the suffering at the end of life. But if you have spent your life trying to avoid those little sufferings, when you have to endure great sufferings, you're going to be that much less equipped.
That's right. And it's time for us as a church to teach the beauty of what we mean by redemptive suffering.
Yeah.
We need to teach what that means and to not be afraid of it or ashamed of it. Its language and its beauty. We need to be able to call out the false language of this valorizing of autonomy. It's false. and it's led us down these very dangerous pathways. We need to also teach what the church teaches and how a moral approach is made.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean? And what does that look like, particularly in healthcare? And we need to aim ourselves at educating and helping our brothers and sisters in healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting thing. We all love pointing fingers, right? And very few people want to take accountability. Well, the person made that decision. Well, what are we doing to change that?
Yeah.
And to really help people to make decisions that reflect and respect their dignity,
Mm-hmm.
and help people in healthcare to know how to respond to those situations, and to be able in conscience to say, I cannot help you with that. I cannot do that. And that's the real challenge before us.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say in closing, I'll toss it back, and but is the also within the pastoral ministry,
Mm-hmm.
is mine was just that little stab.
Yeah.
But for me, it worked. And it opened more doors than it closed. Wow. And it gave more opportunity to have a legitimate conversation, mm-hmm. and actually to help people prepare themselves peacefully, mm-hmm. and sacramentally for their death. And not be afraid of it.
Yeah.
And for the family to be part of it,
mm-hmm.
And not isolate it from it. Everyone kind of walking on eggshells about something that is part, sadly, because God did not intend us to have this in the beginning, but that we all will face this moment.
Yeah.
And it's nothing for me to be afraid of,
mm-hmm.
And our Lord says, be not afraid.
I think that was why, I remember when we had Amanda Achman on the podcast, mm-hmm. originally the episode was why you need to talk about death. And it was basically like, no, everyone goes through this. Everyone loses people to death. Like, this is like the universal human experience, like birth and death. Like, not everyone gets married. Not everyone, has all these different experiences, but everybody is born. Well, except for children who are killed in the womb. So not even everyone is born, but everyone dies.
That's right.
And so being able to talk about it, being able to prepare for it, being able to be honest about the fact of like, okay, this is what grief looks like. This is how you walk with someone who's grieving.
Correct.
This is like that whole conversation around death we're so afraid to have, but it's the universal human experience. So,
right.
Father, to wrap up the episode today, I want you to give 2 calls of action. One to any listeners who may be in Ireland or in the UK of something that they can do. And then also, since most of our audience is in the United States, what people in the US can and should learn from this, what you're calling them to do.
So the first thing, back to the England, Wales, to Ireland. So obviously we already have a bill that's made it through the House of Commons.
In the UK.
In the UK. Now it's in the House of Lords. I don't know. I looked today, as I said earlier, I'm not sure where its status is. But what I would say there is we need to call. People need to take an active approach, reach out to those that are representing them in the House of Lords, and make it very clear that we are not in support of this at all, and we will not support this. And so we need to educate people, and to have it. So the bishops has been very vocal. I pray that they continue to be vocal and continue to call out a very, very bad bill that that if ratified would be extremely dangerous to the culture that's already in a precarious situation with the killing of its young in the womb, and the very fact that the unwelcoming of children and the low birth rates. This is a dangerous thing that's only going to exasperate an already bad situation. In Ireland, where assisted suicide is not legal, but you have people within policy, within government, even within healthcare, who are advocating. It's time to get involved and know what is happening, what is the current. So most people, when I brought up the very fact that there was a legislative act that was attempted in 2024, looked at me very puzzled, like a deer in the headlights.
Ooh.
So unfamiliarity what's happening. And each country, Colleen, is so different because people want to believe that government has their best interest. I would love to believe that, all right? But that's not the case. And that doesn't mean every member. It just means as a whole, no. And the idea is I have to take a stand, and I need to be knowledgeable of what's happening so that things just don't easily wash over me like the tide. So I need to stand my ground, educate, form your mind, call the people in decision making, make other people aware. I was surprised in all the places I visited in Ireland, no one was familiar with it. They were shocked when I brought it up. And I had all the links all on the PowerPoints for them. I pulled them up for people to see.
Yeah.
I'm not making this up. As one of my former canon lawyers, professors, used to tell me, I don't make them up. I don't make them up. These are legitimate things that people need to be familiar with.
Yeah.
And their own government is doing it. And they need to be aware. In the United States, it's a similar issue, because we have an aging population, we have low birth rates, we have limited resources, and all the same dynamics we see playing out in other countries is right here on our own home turf.
And some states have already legalized it.
And let's be honest, the ones that legalize it are the very ones that fought and advocated for abortion rights and have now and actually changed their constitutions to, quote unquote, give a right to the murder of a child in the womb. Now they're moving toward basically the murder at the end of life, or killing those with terminal illnesses, or, as in certain countries, Colleen, where you can be diagnosed with Down syndrome and basically you've lost your right to life. And the government starts pressuring parents to end the life of their own child, or a child that's diagnosed with some type of other genetic abnormality or difficulty. And all this pressure is being placed. And as we deal with less resources available, that pressure is going to grow ever the more for more legitimization of assisted suicide. So all the restrictions will disappear, and basically it just becomes an unended possibility of anyone can choose for themselves. So we really need to push against this. And we need more people in the United States to become aware and not have the approach, well, it's not in my state, why would it bother me? Because it affects a human person, no matter where that person is. This idea of just my own little zone, my own little bubbled life needs to be popped.
Well, and also, like you said, that's how they first got abortion kind of entrenched in America, is you have certain states legalize it, and then next thing you know, it makes it easier for something like Roe to happen. So even if it's not affecting your state right now, first of all, doctor shopping is going to be a thing. People go between states. There's going to be interstate assisted suicide, euthanasia, and then also you're kind of running the risk of the whole nation having to legalize something, even if your state doesn't want it.
That's right. And I think, and just deeper than all that, just getting out from underneath policy, law, and all of it, what does it speak of a country?
You always go back to the principles. I go to the practical.
Yeah, but they're both and. It's both and, absolutely. But to me, it's because ultimately I'm after people's hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Because then the practical happens the right way. So it's not an either or. It really is a both and. But it's the idea that and that's what I love about HLI Ireland and many of our affiliates around the world, and we have the same approach. It's a spiritual battle. It's a battle over hearts and minds.
Yes.
It's a battle over formation of those hearts and minds to understand what it means to love, respect, serve, and defend human life. And how do we advocate for life at its very beginning to its natural end, and how do we fight for it in between? And so we have to really keep advocating, and really teaching, but we need to move away from a violent culture that we've created. If violence, it is what John Paul often spoke of, is that there is this what do you call the campaign in support of life? But he says there's an ill will, and I'm paraphrasing, but an ill will. There's just an intent of evil upon human life. It's a violence. It's created a mindset. You said a framework, and we see it out. We play it every day. The amount of murders around our country, the assault on the vulnerable, the abuse of those that can't fight for themselves. It plays out in every realm.
Yeah.
The spiritual battle. So I want to end by just saying we have to turn back to Christ. We have to turn back to God. We have to be a nation that says we're under God. Well, we need to be a nation that lives under God's rules.
Yeah.
Thou shalt not kill. We need to live under the commandments of God. And adhere to those commands and live in accord with his will. And if we do that, then we will hear what our God has taught from the very beginning of his relationship with us. And that is, to love your neighbor as yourself, which I know comes with our Lord, but it goes back to the very beginning. And so we have to really challenge this, and I that's why I believe it really is a spiritual battle. It's principalities, it's demons, it's all that's involved, and that to me is where the starting point is.
Well, the good news is that we win in the end. So, got to keep fighting right now. You know who wins in the end?
Who's already won?
Who's already won? Yeah. Thank you so much for the conversation, Father. This has been great.
Thank you. Look forward to being with you again soon.
Me too. And to all of our audience, please like this video if you found it helpful and subscribe to the channel so you get more videos like this. And if you think you know which year the UK legalized abortion, leave your either knowledge or guesses in the comment section. I'd like to know what everyone's thoughts are on that. And as always, keep on living the culture of life. God bless.